Are fortunate enough to have Mr. Daryl Parks of Parks and Crump, who has been standing by. We are going to continue with this interview. Mr. Parks, thank you so much for staying with us. I know Diana Tennis wanted to chime in on this, and so Diana, I will let you fire away. Go ahead.
Hey, Daryl, how are you doing?
I'm fine, thank you.
Great. You know, I wanted to say, first of all, I totally agree with that last point that you made. I thought the weird, random Slim Jim, not a Slim Jim, burglary tool randomly found days later, didn't go anywhere, didn't come close to being tied to anything, and I agree with you. I wish they hadn't gone there. But here's my question for you. I know that the state argued well and effectively today that there are some things from George Zimmerman's past that kind of helped make him the person that he was, that might have given him some of that motivation to be the first physical aggressor. And that's really what we're trying to get at, I think, in part, is who is the first physical aggressor. But we also had some evidence that Trayvon Martin may have said something that could be taken as negative, maybe even racial, maybe even angry. So why is it that some of this stuff now from Trayvon Martin's past to show the full person that he was in this scenario that maybe would have given him motive to be the first physical aggressor? Because really, at this point, I think we just don't have a real good picture of what the state's version is of how it is this first physical confrontation started. Do you think that might be fair to let in some of those things if the judge let these things in about George Zimmerman?
No, it wouldn't be fair for two reasons, both factually and legally. Factually, there's nothing to support that Trayvon Martin in any type of way was following George Zimmerman. We've now heard testimony that George Zimmerman must have passed Trayvon at least 3 times, right? Trayvon, the factual record is clear, was trying to get away from George Zimmerman. In fact, when you're reminded of George Zimmerman's testimony, well, what you heard him say is that even when Trayvon passed near the vehicle, he put his hand in his pocket as if he was trying to intimidate George. He kept walking. Then he tried to get away. He went, and George came behind him. He either ran down the T or hid near the T. George went past the T. He's told us initially to try and find the address, but we know also he said in the end of the interview that he went across to meet the police on Retreat View Circle. Well, we know that's now going to be a big problem for him. Now, the mere fact that we now know that Trayvon may have come and said, hey, why are you following me, or what's going on, or whatever the words he may have used, it's clear that he was trying to find out why was this guy coming in after him. So there's nothing to suggest that Trayvon has been the aggressor when we now know that when he told Rachel that, hey, this guy is looking at me. He tells Rachel that he's running away from the guy. And even George says he's running. So any notion of trying to bring up anything about Trayvon, which certainly, as you know, trigger word lawyers have more of a prejudicial value than a probative value.
Can I just chime in and say, isn't there a real question about what are exactly the facts of this case? Because unfortunately, Trayvon can't testify and give his version of events, so we have to go off of what George's version of the events are, or what Rachel Gentel's version of the events are, based on a phone call that she had with Trayvon. So we don't 100% know and can say for certainty that Trayvon did not come out of the bushes and come after George was going back to his car. His state of mind may have been he thought he was being followed, but we can't say with certainty that Trayvon wasn't the first aggressor, in the sense that he approached George and threw the punch that George, at least that's George's testimony, correct?
Well, let me give you, and even if you believe what George says, right, the 2 important points came out in the interview that I thought were very pertinent. Number one, when George saw him in the vehicle, he did not identify himself. He just had an opportunity to say who he was and ask Trayvon while George was sitting in the vehicle. Number 2, when George approached Trayvon allegedly near the T, George never said who he was. And so when Trayvon approached him and asked him, why are you following me? George's response was to go into his pocket as if he was getting something. Well, if you believe what George says, and if Trayvon decked him at that point, he had the right to. You're in a dark alley, a guy's been following you, he's going in his pocket. What are you going to do, let him bring it out? No, you're not going to do that. But let's do this. Let's take the conversation, if y'all don't mind, just one step further. Let's take him down to the ground. He says he's hit near the T. We now know that Trayvon's body was not found by the T, found further down the sidewalk, so we know that they had to, some type of way, end down the other part of the sidewalk. But I think what's most most important, if you listen to the testimony of his best friend says that the legs of Trayvon were up holding down the arms of George Zimmerman. And George Zimmerman's testimony that any movement they made would have been George Zimmerman moving further down, which meant Trayvon's body would have came further up George's body. And so that means that his whole notion that the gun was being exposed by something that was going on is not true. And so taking the last point as they're on the ground, you have a situation where George knew that the police were coming. In fact, we now know that they got there less than about 20 seconds after all of it went down. And so him knowing that and now knowing what we know how minor the injuries were, he never had to kill Trayvon. So that thing, at the end of the day, that's going to be the real issue. Did he really have to pull the gun and kill Trayvon in light of what he knew and in light of how minimal the injuries are that we now see? And, the one thing I really don't like is everyone keeps flashing the picture of the blood on the head. But we all know that we have plenty of other pictures within 24 hours of him nice and clean, looking well, and doing okay.
So, Daryl, here's my question, and I get totally what you're saying about the argument that George Zimmerman created the circumstances, and I get what you're saying about George Zimmerman not reasonably under the circumstances thinking that his life was in danger. I get both of those points, but if you acknowledge that it appears that the initial physical contact was initiated by Trayvon Martin, what I can't figure out is why would Trayvon Martin then have been doing the yelling for help for 40 minutes if he was in the process of trying to protect himself by hitting George Zimmerman to keep George Zimmerman from doing whatever Trayvon Martin was worried that he would do?
I have a problem with your question because your question assumes that just because you start a fight means you're always winning a fight. That's not logical. You can start a fight, the person then react to you and beat you up.
But we don't have any injuries on. But we don't have any injuries on Trayvon Martin at all to indicate that he ever had a blow to him other than the shot.
Well, I don't think you really know that. You don't know whether or not the autopsy that was done would have indicated if there was any soft tissue injuries to him. I mean, you don't know that. You'd have to ask that question in order to get into that more. But also, too, the type of injuries that you're talking about that George suffered, contusions and abrasions, could have come from rolling around in the grass. So I think given now that we know that the injuries really weren't that bad, most of it went away within 24 hours. His whole notion of the seriousness of the injuries is really I don't think going to be that well received because unlike the bloody pictures that we keep seeing over and over again, they're also going to see the pictures that show him doing relatively well. So obviously he was not in a life-threatening situation.
Mr. Parks, it took me a second to digest that last thing that you said about the injuries could have happened in rolling around in the grass. And I don't recall Dr. Rowe, when Mark O'Mara was cross-examining her, I don't remember rolling around in the grass causing the injuries ever coming up as a possibility of being consistent with those injuries. Is that something that was discussed? Did that go past me?
Well, first of all, let's be clear about a lawyer in cross-examination asking leading questions in which he's really trying to testify as to what he believes happened isn't always the testimony of a witness. Given. Now, so I agree with you. So when I say rolling around in the grass, what I'm talking about is the mere fact that obviously they were hitting each other, so some of the injuries had to come from fists. I'll give you that. Mm-hmm. And then some of it may have come from possible touch of the concrete, right? However, the one thing she was very clear about, in all likelihood, he had not touched the concrete that many times. But let's go back to the testimony of Mr. Good for a second last Friday, because I think that's pretty important. Okay. And even yesterday, George's description, he describes the fact that Trayvon may have had his mouth and his nose, right? And so you have this whole tussling and wrestling going on with him testifying that the mouth and the nose are being touched. Right. What you don't have is this MMA beatdown style ground and pound that Mark O'Mara tried to sell earlier on in this case.
Well, I think we got two possibilities, and I appreciate exactly what you're saying. Diana's saying if Trayvon's the one throwing the punches, why would he be the one yelling out for help? And then by George Zimmerman's own testimony, he says his nose had been broken, he had blood in his mouth, and Trayvon supposedly was trying to cover up his nose and his mouth. So how is he the one then yelling for help? Do you know what I mean?
Someone covering his mouth.
With someone covering his
very
mouth.
Interesting conversation we have going here. Unfortunately, we're going to have to take a quick break. We'll come back. We'll continue the discussion. You can see the court is in recess right now. They're expected to reconvene at around 1:45. You're watching coverage of Day 8 of testimony in the George Zimmerman trial.
Welcome back. Thanks for staying with us. Got about another half hour or so of a recess in the George Zimmerman trial. They broke about 12:45, and they're going to go until about 1:45. So we are going to continue our analysis of the morning testimony on the George Zimmerman case.
Yeah, we only have attorney Daryl Parks for about another 5 minutes or so. So, Daryl, I want to go back out to you. What do you make of George Zimmerman's history, his college records being brought in here, that he actually learned in classes, professor said, about stand your ground and about self-defense? And, you know, what was self-defense? How do you think that plays into his defense here?
Well, I think it's very important. I think the person that you're dealing with in a case becomes pretty important so that you have some background as to who you're dealing with. And so this jury now knows that George Zimmerman is a guy who back in Prince William County, Virginia, applied to be a police officer. They now know that even here in Seminole County, he had done some ride-along stuff with law enforcement. And then he continued that pursuit by going to Seminole State College to pursue his criminology degree. And so, and then inherent in that was the fact that he had taken some courses that had studied the whole self-defense methodology. So the person that they want to describe as a novice who may not have had much experience in dealing with law enforcement, may not have known how to interact with law enforcement, actually had a pretty good background in knowing that you want to be as forthright, you want to appear to be as forthright. And so, you know, self-serving statements like, you know, my God, I hope there were other cameras around, which we've heard Marco Mayer repeat time and time again. Well, he knows that those are the kind of things that law enforcement would want to hear if there's a chance that you're trying to prove your innocence, whether you're innocent or not.
Mr. Parks, Judge Alex Ferrer made a point yesterday, and we'll talk with him a little bit more about this. During the Sean Hannity interview, George Zimmerman did indicate that during that moment when he says he felt his life was threatened, in the Sean Hannity interview, he said it was happening so fast, he wasn't sure. He didn't know if his life was threatened. Is that going to be a big enough window opening for the state to get into George Zimmerman's state of mind that you can't shoot an unarmed teenager unless you are absolutely sure in your head, unless your state of mind is you feel like you are going to die at that moment? And in that interview, he indicated that he wasn't sure.
Well, he has to say that, because if he doesn't say that, then he actually has no self-defense. So at the end of the day, we now know there was a fight, and some have described it as wrestling and tussling, and yes, they were near the sidewalk. But let me also point out, in George's Hannity interview, he says that my head was on the concrete a little. And that's important, right? Because you've heard some try to mischaracterize that his whole torso was up on the concrete, his whole head was on the concrete. He has now said that my head was on the concrete a little. That's important, right? Because he knew that if he moved a little bit, his head wouldn't be on the concrete. Mm-hmm. And so the big threat to his life was not there, because yet had they moved some more, his head wouldn't have been there. And yes, Trayvon was grabbing his mouth, his nose, but George knew that the police officers were on the way. He knew. I mean, he knew that they should be passing momentarily. Yet he thought that he should take such strong action than to take out his firearm and to shoot into the heart of Trayvon Martin. That's wrong. Yeah, that's wrong.
Mr. Parks, I want to be very clear what the question that I said, because I think you might have misunderstood me. In the Sean Hannity interview, George Zimmerman claims that he felt his life was not threatened. At least he indicated that. At the moment before the shot came, he claims, according to what he said to Sean Hannity, he was not sure whether or not his life was threatened. And if he was not sure, then his self-defense claim falls to pieces. Is that a big enough window for the state to prosecute this case?
It's a big window, and thank you for clearing that up for me. It's a big window. If that's what he said on there, and I'll go back and look at that as well, because I think that's an important point. If he wasn't sure, then he absolutely had no right to pull a gun, to use deadly force to kill Trayvon Martin.
All right, Daryl Parks, thanks for being with us. We really appreciate your time. We know you got to get back into the courtroom, but I want to kind of expand on this Hannity interview. Let's bring in our analysts at this point. Well, we'll take a break first, and then we will speak to Bill Vose and get his opinion on that interview coming up right after this short break.